Hello, and welcome back to Hunt Hill at Home. You might be wondering, where is Sage? Well, I'm Sandy, the sandhill crane, and I'm going to tell you the joke of the day, and then I'll let Sage come. So, what do you call a pelican with its beak taped shut? I don't know, Sandy. What do you call it? A pelicant. Well, welcome back, everyone. Me and Sandy, the sandhill crane, are going to be talking about beaks today. And beaks are amazing things, and you can learn a lot about a bird just by looking at its beak. So, I've brought out a few different types of bird skeletons with different types of beaks, and we'll get to look at what those kinds of beaks are and see some cool adaptations that birds have. So, we'll start with these two. This one right here is our turkey vulture. And then this one right here is our red-tailed hawk. They are very, very similar when you look at their beaks. This is really helpful because they eat pretty similar things, except one eats things that are alive and one eats things that are dead. So, with the hawk actually has to catch its prey. So, it will catch live prey, whereas the turkey vulture will look for prey to scavenge. But they've both got these sharp points on their beaks. These sharp points are important for ripping and tearing the flesh of the animal that they're eating and to holding on tight to anything that it catches. We also have things like Sandy the sandhill crane and our great blue heron that have these nice long beaks. These are great for poking into the mud and into the reeds and picking out things like frogs and little fish and all sorts of little creatures they can catch. We also have this tiny little skull right here. This one is our flycatcher, and it is nice and long and thin to catch those little tiny insects out of the sky. And of course, we have our finch. Now, the finch is actually what helped Charles Darwin come up with the theory of natural selection. And the reason that the finches were helpful was because he found finches on every single island in the Galapagos, and they were all so very different depending on what kind of thing that they ate. So, finches all have very interesting beaks. When you look at them, you can tell that they're pretty wide and thick. That is really helpful for things like chomping on thicker seeds and nuts and breaking through that outer casing. So, let's take a look at some different adaptations that bird beaks have. I'm going to pull up my table here. So, in here I've got some water and I have these little sponges. These sponges are going to represent fish or other things swimming in the water. Now, one animal that eats a lot of fish and other things in the water is a pelican. And they've got a bill that is kind of spoon-shaped. It's got space for it to hold a lot of water, and then it will let the water drain out. That is an ideal shape for catching things like fish because it can just scoop them right up. Now, if another type of bird tried to catch a fish, they might not be so successful. Remember the finch that I was talking about? They've got these thick beaks, kind of like my pliers here. These thick, strong beaks are great for grabbing nuts and breaking them, but they're not super great at catching fish. So, the finch is not going to be a fish catcher. We also have things like hummingbirds. Hummingbirds have nice, long, thin beaks kind of like this pipette here. And they're great for pulling up liquids like nectar, but they're not great at catching fish. The hummingbird would just end up drinking a lot of water and not getting any fish at all. Then we also have strong but thin beaks, like these tweezers here. And these ones are great for things like our woodpeckers, because they're nice and thin for going into little holes in trees, and they're strong, but they're not great at catching fish either. Oh, I did catch a fish there, but they wouldn't have a very strong beak for holding on to that fish once it's got it. Now let's look at another example, because not all animals are catching fish. Some are poking holes in wood. So imagine that this is a piece of wood, and all of these tiny little dots here are insects that buried themselves into the wood. Now, if a pelican were trying to get something out of there, it's not going to be super successful. It can't scoop it up like the fish. The hummingbird's not going to be successful either. There's no nectar to suck up. The finches might be successful if they can catch on to something, but they can't poke their beaks into the wood very far. But a woodpecker is going to be very successful because it can actually peck around where an insect is, and then it can use its tiny thin beak to pull that insect out. These are just grains of rice, they're not actually insects. We might also have a flower with some nectar. Here's my flower, and then the nectar is down inside the flower. Now, none of our other birds are going to be very successful at this. The woodpecker could peck into the flower, but it'd destroy the flower, and it doesn't have any way to suck up the nectar once it gets there. The finch would just destroy the flower. It's too big. The pelican could scoop up the flower, but it's not going to be able to drink the nectar. But when we've got our hummingbird, they have the perfect fit to go right inside and drink up some nectar. Finally, we have some acorns or other seeds or nuts. Now, a pelican could scoop up an acorn, but it's not going to be able to take the shell off of it, and all the nutrients are inside the shell. Our woodpeckers could pick up an acorn, maybe, but again, it's not going to be able to break this outer shell very easily. Our hummingbird is not very helpful at all. It can't drink anything from this acorn. So that's why it's so important for the finches to have these strong and thick beaks so that it can hold and crush the acorns and get all the tasty stuff out of it. So, I hope you learned a little bit about bird beaks, and I hope you go outside and look at some birds. Take a look at their beaks, see what shapes they are, and try to figure out what kind of thing those birds could eat. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.